Jim really set us up nicely by talking about the macro U.S. situation now, and we're going to try to kind of drill down somewhat and talk about the situation in communities and on the ground for Americans living in this economy. I'm David Leonhardt. I'm a writer at the New York Times, and I am joined by Michael George, who is with formerly with the Treasury Department, and currently with the Treasury Department, formerly with the White House, and formerly with the Gates Foundation, and with Prabal Chakrabarti, who's an executive vice president for regional and community outreach at the Boston Fed. So you're just going to forecast interest rates for us, right?
Well, I think Turba has just done so. They're going to be straight as a big plateau as long as the eye can see.
Prabal is not going to forecast interest rates for us. So we want to talk about a few different things. Our goal is to talk about revitalizing America's communities. And we all want to start with this question, well, why do we even need to talk about revitalization? What's the problem with America's communities? And the central way that I think about this, there are lots of statistics, lots of economic statistics, lots of social measures, but I think the single best measure of how a society is serving its people is how long people live. It's not the only measure. But in the 1980s, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a high-income country. Maybe a little bit below average if you look closely at the chart, but we were really right in the middle. And so we're now talking about all the high-income countries in the world, every country in Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and we were sort of right in the middle. Starting in the early 1980s, our life expectancy began growing more slowly than every other country on that list. By the early 2000s, the United States had the lowest life expectancy of any high-income country in the world. This is the first chart in my book, which the Marshall Foundation has generously bought and is out there for you all if you want it. And now it's not even particularly close. The United States trails every other high-income country in life expectancy by quite a substantial margin. And there is no one single explanation. There are many different reasons. But I'm interested in asking kind of each of you, how do you think about it on the top level way that our economy and our society has served so many of our citizens so poorly relative to our peer countries?
It's a great question. I'm going to start with life expectancy, where you left us. So there's a lot of work done around the social determinants of health, as our public health friends can tell us. And of course, these are the economic conditions that give rise to so many of these so many of these health conditions. I work for the Fed. I'm here in a personal capacity. I work and oversee community development and also economic development. And was meeting with a public health person who came in and said, you know what? Actually, you at the Fed are public health workers. And I'm like, really? And he said, yes. And here's why. It sort of painted this connection to me, to employment, to household financial stability, and all of the health indicators that flow from that. And so when I look at, the question you posed, a big question, right, about American condition in America, if I look over a decades-long period, maybe we'll start in the late 70s through to, certainly through to COVID, what you see is, in particular, a declining ability for the lowest income Americans literally to survive, right? Without government programs, it would be very difficult with the wages that were provided, right, in low wage jobs to survive, to have enough food and clothing and medicine for their families without government supports. And even then, it's literally just on the edge. And so the question, of course, is why, and does it have to be that way? And let me just tell you, and I could say this even from the Fed, it does not have to be this way. There's no economic reason why you have to have an economy that delivers so poorly for its lowest wage workers. It absolutely doesn't have to be that way. It's a combination of obviously public policy and employer practices and all the investments in human capital. All of these things come together to give us an outcome that we should not find acceptable. And so one of the key factors here has been the declining sort of bargaining power, if you will, of workers due to sort of structural reasons in the economy. And economists, and I'm not here speaking as an economist, I've written about this as a paper by Stansbury and Summers that sort of goes into this quite deeply and really does find that the declining bargaining power has been a huge factor in the decline in living standards, and that leads back to some of the health indicators. The one thing I will say, and I'll close with this on this question with this, is since the pandemic, we have had a very tight labor market, and some of the kind of stagnation of the lowest wage workers has actually begun to reverse itself. The question, of course, is, we had a period of very high inflation, and so are people able to actually have wages they haven't yet caught up for some of that increase, but then if you look at the longer period of time, you really see some of the expenses around health and food, basic necessities, as well as other goods. Households simply, even with this increase in wages, are still struggling to get by. But there is some promising news, at least as a result of this tight labor market.
Michael, how do you think about the kind of key question of why do we need revitalization? What about our modern economy and society has failed so many people?
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for having me here today. I think it's such a complicated question, and I think the way I think about it is that you have to approach it with all the complexity on the table. Like, I think there are things that are going wrong in this country, right? But at the same time, women's employment population ratio is at the highest rate it's ever been since we started tracking that data in 1948. On the other hand, the black-white wealth gap, it was 52 to 1 in 1851. It was 7 to 1 in the 1950s, and it's kind of still 6 or 7 to 1 today, which is, I think, if you think about everything that has happened since the 50s, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all the laws we have passed over those decades, I think that's a really humbling finding. One way I've kind of thought about it is that we live in a really, really diverse and large country, and then all of these aspects play out in really different ways in different communities. We have, there are parts of the United States, like let's say North Dakota, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, that are essentially kind of like Sweden in like the percent of low-income children who will grow up to be high-income families. We have other parts of the United States that basically just never happens. We have cities like Atlanta that have had the highest kind of job growth rates over the past 20 or 30 years among large cities. At the same time, Atlanta has among the lowest rates of upward mobility for low-income children of all cities in the United States. So you have all these kind of contradictions that I think, that's why a lot of smart people in this room, I think, are thinking about this question, because I don't think it has easy answers. You've talked about life expectancy. There are parts of the United States where the gap between high income and low income life expectancy has actually narrowed over time, which is really promising. But then the research says it has no correlation with medical access or health insurance in the local area. Like, I find that to be a really humbling finding that suggests we don't know a lot yet. Like, there's a lot more to do to unpack this. And I think what we can do is kind of agree on the things we care about. There's life expectancy, wealth inequality, employment, a lot of different things that can be targeted in a lot of different ways.
And I should have said at the beginning, we're going to open this up to comments and thoughts and questions at the end. So if you all have thoughts about this, please keep them, and we'll leave plenty of time for that at the end. I'm struck, Michael, you talk about the white-black wage, the wealth gap, and Prabal, you talk about collective bargaining. One of the things that's really fascinating, and it seems to me important when we think about how to narrow these gaps, is that when you look back over history, the period with the most rapid narrowing in the modern economy of basically every white-black measure, income, wealth, life expectancy, is the 40s and early 50s, which is before the civil rights movement, and a lot of it comes from collective bargaining. Those were the years when unions, which had basically kept out black workers, began admitting them, and black Americans got to participate in the power of collective bargaining. And it had this just remarkable narrowing of the white-black wage gap, and gives you a sense for how even kind of policies that are not race-specific can have a racially specific effect, because we have such large racial inequities. When we reduce overall economic inequality, we can also shrink some of these racial gaps, which is really interesting. You talked about collective bargaining in particular. The Fed's mandate is obviously including full employment.
Yeah.
Dual mandate. I sometimes wonder, not from the Fed's perspective, it may well be enough from the Fed's perspective, but it seems to me that in our unequal economy, maybe the last few years are going to start to reverse it a little bit. But as you said, it hasn't really done much to reverse the long-term inequality. As we think about it from a society, is full employment enough? When I look at the American economy, I think that a shortage of good jobs is a much bigger problem than a shortage of jobs. Do you think that's wrong? Is full employment too narrow from a societal perspective, not from a Fed perspective, but from a societal perspective? Do you agree with the notion that our bigger problem is lack of good jobs? Actually, we have quite an abundant number of jobs overall.
So I really like how you put it. And again, like I'm not here, the Fed has a specific definition of full employment, but when Congress gave us our mandate, they actually wrote in maximum employment. And so I actually see that as, I'd like to take the broadest possible view of a mandate. And when I think about maximum employment, I would include some of these other characteristics in it, the nature, the quality of the job, right? And when we think about the job, it's not just the job, it's the benefits that go along with it. Retirement benefits, for example, which speaks to that wealth gap that you spoke of and access to a retirement plan. Thinking obviously about health benefits. We have employer-provided health insurance in the United States. And so that's an important aspect of access. But even, I'm going to really broaden this here and think about more sort of familial concerns, because we're not just workers, right? We're people, we're humans, many of us are in families. And when you think about just the rise of remote work and people's desire for remote work, people want and need to have flexibility. In many of our parts of our country, the transit systems, well, if we even have public transit systems, they're often underfunded, but a lot of times there isn't. People have to rely on a car. Cars are expensive. Maintaining them is expensive. Transit is unreliable. People can't get to the jobs on the right shifts and at the right shift times. And so these are also, I would argue, characteristics of a good job. Can you get to the job? Does it allow for your people in family to be sort of watched over? I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the employer is providing childcare, providing all of these things, but rather, does your job, do you sit in a context in which not only do you receive a wage, but does your job have some of these kinds of characteristics? That's how I would view really like maximum employment or full employment. Of course, the Fed takes a specific view and it sort of looks at is trying to fulfill its dual mandate. But I look at it more broadly when I think about our country's sort of economic flourishing as a whole.
Let's talk about the communities aspect of this. So if we were to disaggregate those statistics on life expectancy, we would see that the life expectancy of people in the United States who have a 4-year college degree, actually that line kind of looks a lot like the line in other countries. Looks almost European or South Korean. Looks fine. It's the flatlining of the life expectancy line for people who don't have a 4-year degree. And that then translates into these huge geographic inequalities that we see, both within metro areas, but also across metro areas. Why is it fundamentally, and what can we do about the fact that really we have had this incredible rise in geographic inequality, in which places, metro areas like Chicago, like the places where I'm guessing almost everyone in this room live, have moved away from smaller and medium-sized metro areas?
I mean, one thing I'd say about that is I do think we're in a really unique moment post-pandemic where a lot of things are changing all at once. And when a lot of things change all at once, I think that gives an opportunity to kind of redefine some of the relationships we have with these, like moving across the country. I mean, I think I read that 100,000 remote workers left New York City in 2023, 20,000 in Chicago. This is a reversal of kind of a long-standing trend where we've seen college-educated workers flock to our big cities, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Chicago, in a way that kind of slowed down the regional convergence we've seen over the past 20 to 30 years, typically, which has basically just halted. So I think one reason I'm optimistic, I think, is that the kind of growth of remote work has kind of upset a little of those existing relationships and allowed, in one way it's bad. Why are college-educated workers fleeing New York City? Housing is really high. Housing costs are really high. It's really expensive. You want to move to Austin. But on the other hand, that does mean that a lot of that kind of concentration is deconcentrating also in this moment. I think another reason it's a really unique moment is, I mean, the federal government has passed a bunch of laws that are going to surge investment across the country. You can talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, you can talk about the CHIPS Act, you can talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law. Most of those laws have built-in requirements, for example, bonus tax credits if your solar or wind facility is located in a former coal community or in a low-income community, such that we see over 80% of the IRA's investments going to counties with below median wage and below median college graduation rates. So, I I think it's going to take a long time to reverse what you've so aptly put as decades of stagnation or divergence. But I do think there's a moment now where there's a little bit of an opportunity. I think to bring it back to what you were saying about the importance of collective bargaining in labor, I think one thing, I was really fortunate to work for the vice president for the past 3 years, but I should clarify, I am also speaking in my personal capacity. One thing she's often said is that we're entering a new era of labor organizing because of tight labor markets. Workers have power and leverage that they may not have had before. We have a surge of investment leading to new construction, new facilities across the country. We have unions at their kind of most popular rate ever. Unions are bipartisan. 50% of Republicans like unions, 80% of Democrats like unions. So there is kind of a moment that I think we can seize, and I think the question is, will we seize it?
Prabal, for a long time, and probably still, people said, well, people should just move.
Yep.
They should just leave places like downstate Illinois and upstate New York and go to places like Chicago and Boston. It strikes me as problematic advice. How do you think about it?
Well, it's funny you say that. In 2006-07, when I joined the Fed, we were looking at places in my New England district like Hartford and Springfield and Lawrence, places that are like here, like Joliet, Aurora, Rockford, Gary. And we had this discussion, and the head of the research department said, people should just move. And I was like, well, I'm doing community development. That's not a winning message to go out to communities and say, why are you guys living here? So, I mean, that was going to be a tough thing. But I just felt this was wrong, right? And it didn't matter what, economic theories or whatever you would put on there about the, dual sector labor model or something, having people move. It didn't make sense to me. And so we, as the Fed, I'm going to sort of a long research paper short, looked around to see are there any cities like small cities that face decades of deindustrialization doing well around the country. And we found a set of cities that were doing not great, not keeping up with the U.S. as a whole, but then maintain their economic vitality. And so the question was why? Why these places and not, the Hartfords and Springfields of the world? And to make a long research paper short, a lot of things mattered: investment in infrastructure, investment by anchor institutions like universities and hospitals, right, in their community, but also leadership that was cross-sector, could bring sectors, public, private, nonprofit, together with a vision and measurement and accountability for that vision. And so we at the Boston Fed decided to put together a competition to incentivize, with still a lot of economists, incentivize that kind of behavior and reward it where it was happening. And so we partnered with philanthropy and the state to give grants, provide technical assistance and resource to cities that had these kind of attributes. And again, a winning city, so to share the story, in 2010, a local magazine, Boston Magazine, put on the cover story a story about Lawrence, Mass. 80,000 people, important city in during the Industrial Revolution, textile manufacturing, decades of job loss. So the headline of the story was Lawrence, City of the Damned. That was the headline. And, it's like, but these are people. I mean, it was just, and that city rose up and they were so upset. They all marched to the editorial. They got buses, vans, and marched to that magazine. And they actually won the first Working Cities Challenge, which is the effort that we put together. And It was people, citizens coming together, the business community, the municipality, the nonprofit. They focused on increasing family income and measuring the impact on student test scores. And, family income in Lawrence during this time period went up, and it went up by more than the Massachusetts average. But there's a lot of factors that go into this, right? And these cities are all going to have their fits and starts. But they are better off than where they started. And I think that might be the measure. If we look for a measure, it's going to take a lot of time to get to the US average and to the superstar city level. I mean, let's not every place is going to make it. Not every place is going to do great. But can they get better from where they are today, and do that with really strong communities working together across sectors? That's really what at least this research found, and what our experience has found to be an important factor in the capacity of communities to be revitalized.
I think that's a really important story, because as we think about revitalizing communities, I think there are the economic ideas, which are really important, but there are also another set of ideas involving respect. Right. And respecting people's values, and the idea that, when we say to people you should just move, it sort of ignores the fact that people have churches, and they have high school basketball teams, and they have parents, and they have real reasons to want to live in that community. And I think that when we see some of the divide in our society, so many people in these communities are deeply distrustful of experts, honestly, in an unhealthy way. They are actively hostile to the Democratic Party and large parts of higher education and the progressive left and all this. And I think if we think about how we're going to try to solve some of these things, not telling these communities, well, that's because you're ignorant, or that's because your ideas are wrong, but listening with some more respect is going to be really important to that. Before we get to folks' comments and questions, let's talk a little bit about the clean energy transition, because if I were to think about the three great challenges facing our country domestically, sadly, I think we now have to add some international threats. To me, it would be democracy, it would be these living standards challenges we've talked about, and then it would be climate change, right? And so at a time when many people are struggling with day-to-day living standards and feel like they've been rising slowly, it can be difficult to persuade them, well, you also should care about the future by adopting more expensive energy or non-obvious energy. But it does feel to me like the last couple years offer some reason for optimism on that. Michael, can you talk about how important you think, you ticked off a couple pieces of legislation. Can you talk specifically about how important you think some of these clean energy new legislation that we have, particularly Inflation Reduction Act, it's such a funny name that I can't seem to remember. And then maybe also the infrastructure bill a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think, one thing the president and the vice president have said before is that we've kind of made the largest investment in our infrastructure since the Eisenhower era. There is so much federal investment right now in so many different domains that there is really an opportunity. And a lot of, some of these are grants and competitions where, let's say, Department of Energy or whomever will pick sites across the country, but a lot of it is locally driven. A lot of it is tax credits that businesses, they pick a site where they want to open a factory, they meet the requirements, they get their work subsidized via the tax code. And I think the fact that there is so much kind of flexibility built into that, the Inflation Reduction Act's subsidies are essentially uncapped for most things. So in other words, it's kind of as much as we want it, it is there until someone decides to repeal it or along those lines. And I think that is something that can't be understated. We can seize as much of it as we want, so long as we kind of build the infrastructure at the local and the state level to take advantage of it. And I think, it goes back a little bit maybe to your story about Lawrence, Prabal. I think different communities have different priorities and different definitions of like what is a good life and what they want. And I think, when you think about climate change, I think it can sound so technical, but climate change has if you're a farm worker in California, climate change can mean heat waves that make it extremely hard for you to work. We're going through a heat wave right now. And I think the fact that we can talk about the Inflation Reduction Act as something that can be highly localized to tailor solutions to the kind of local community context is what makes it real for people. I think the fact that you can talk about kind of a surge in clean energy jobs makes it tangible in the sense that climate change can feel really far away, but a job is a job right now. And a lot of these jobs are going to be, good, I think, union jobs. I think, I think one thing that I find interesting is when you poll Americans about what is the most important thing about their job, of course, kind of your salary is one of the important things, but the most important thing people say is stability and security. And that I think is interesting because we've gone through like a period of a lot of uncertainty with the pandemic, with inflation, whatever. But a lot of these jobs are like, they're not going to go away. Like the clean energy future is here and is going to stay here regardless of what happens in November or the future. So, that is some certainty and some clarity that I think is helpful.
It's really interesting. If you go back and read the history of the 30s and 40s, security was a word that FDR used constantly. That's why it's called Social Security, right? There's just something that is very appealing to people, particularly after hard times, about the idea of security.
Just to say on the green point, what you brought up, there's been some survey work done about African American and Latino communities, and their concern of climate change is actually greater than that of the population as a whole in communities in Boston and neighborhoods because of the heat islands, and even in rural areas, places like Vermont have faced a lot of flooding from rivers as a result. And so when you think about that kind of change, but also the opportunity from green jobs, is there the capacity at the community level to both deal with these kinds of changes and take advantage of opportunities? Because to say, of course, we want to see people, want to respect them, I should say, change is just happening. Change is always happening. It's always going to keep happening. And it's not that every small town in Vermont is going to be able to preserve itself. It's just not going to happen, right? You need some kind of economic viability. But can they rethink themselves as a regional identity around a valley instead of around isolated communities? There's a group in Brattleboro, Vermont that's focused on welcoming new Vermonters, trying to work with employer practices to change shift times, to change, you've got refugees and others there to take advantage of that. And to use that as a community to be able to handle these challenges, right? Heat wave or flooding, but also take advantage of job training funds, electrification, and all the other good economic things that are going to come out of this investment.
How much do you each worry about capacity? So we've got all this funding. We've also got tons of local regulations that make it really hard to build anything. In some cases, we're asking communities to build new things. How much do you worry about execution and capacity, and what can we do to try to make sure that execution doesn't prevent us from taking advantage of all these funds that will make Jim worried about the deficit, but will accelerate the clean energy transition?
I guess I worry a lot. I used to work in the mayor of Oakland's office, and I think I really do think the hardest job in the entire country is being a mayor of a smaller city. Really low capacity. Everyone blames you for every single thing, no matter if you have any connection to it or not. And limited time and limited resources. I think the federal government contributes to that issue too. I think Congress, by its wisdom, writes a lot of requirements into a lot of different grant programs, and then the federal agencies have to implement them, and everyone has to fill out these really, really long forms. I think OMB in the White House has taken some steps to try to simplify that, but it can only go so far. I think that's why the work, Prabal, that you're doing at the local level is really important. A lot of this is new, and for something that's new, if you're the last in line, you may not get it. So, I don't know if I have an answer, but I do think it has to be rooted in kind of that local coordination and local effort. So.
Yeah, I think I worry about this a lot. This is what we're focused on. I think those places that have brought together partners like some of those anchor institutions, the hospital or university. Is that a place for capacity? Can a university have a different kind of role created to be a stitcher together, the connective tissue for some of these things? A hospital could also play that role, right? I mean, we can't all stay in our box. At times we have to respond to what the community needs. So those are, I think, our places of promise. I'm not universally optimistic it's going to work everywhere. It's really hard to just, I mean, a financial opportunity is present, but it's hard to come together around that quickly enough. Sometimes money gets pushed down and sort of it just needs to go where there's a shovel-ready project or a shovel-ready initiative, even if that's not showing a huge amount of promise, even if it's not the best thing for the community. Hopefully what the community has done, I say community with a defined community and who's in it, and it has to include the private sector as well, has done some kind of visioning or planning and built trust so that they're ready for these things to happen. It's that whole thing of like you live your whole life to be an overnight success sort of thing. I'm not suggesting it takes that long, but certainly it takes some years of working on something. The promising thing is you hear these stories of communities that have a tornado or have a flood or something, and people come together, and that really is a galvanizing thing for them, right? It does build some of that trust. Some of those old grudges can become less present, and so it's not a it's not a clean or linear story about what does it take. But there's places that just have that kind of collective efficacy to work together, and I do think there's a really important role for local institutions. The bank, the hospital, the university, the right kind of municipality to really look outside its own lane, if you will, and think about the bigger picture. And that's really the team that needs to be there and be present when these opportunities come up.
We've got an incredible audience here. So I welcome questions and also comments and thoughts. And we've got one I see right here.
Thank you. Craig Kinchin, Marshall Scholar from 1990. I'd like you to speak a little bit about the role of workforce development. So in Indiana, where I'm based, there's a lot of discussion about workforce development, allowing people to have access to jobs without necessarily having four-year degrees. So who's doing workforce development well, and what's the role of workforce development in revitalizing community?
I mean, it's enormously important. Is one of the acts that actually had a very strong bipartisan support. I can't remember what year, it was 2016, 2017, where they did a reauthorization of the workforce funding. Can't remember the acronym, the Workforce Act. And so there's a hugely varying quality in workforce boards across that sort of use this federal funding. It gets back to capacity again. Some very strong, have a good, strong employer presence, make sure that the training is tied to what employers actually need. The funding and financing has been really kind of balkanized where you can only fund somebody who comes in with it like they've just been laid off in the last 6 months from a certain job, but it doesn't reach a different kind of population. And so it's really hard when you have conflicting financing rules, very uneven quality of the workforce boards. Where I think there's a lot of promise, there has been the rise of like these newer models and newer nonprofit models. Some of them are around pay for success, where the social finance is an organization that's run a lot of these kinds of things around the country, where you have just a really tight partnership with employers and not just a single employer. You're focused on populations that may be harder to employ, whether it's ex-offenders, returning citizens, or it's immigrant populations, and just a real strong emphasis on numbers and on sort of metrics. And these kinds of models, pay for success models, have shown to have some promise. That's one place where I see a lot of effectiveness. Community colleges gets talked about as well. I don't know, maybe Michael has some views on the college. I still think there's a college wage premium, so I'm not so much one to sort of discount college. As a Marshall Scholar, I'm not sure it's a good idea to say less education, but I do think there's interesting questions about what you major in, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd add is, I mean, the workforce development system in this country is just chronically underfunded. I mean, it gets nowhere near the attention it deserves. And you see all these like really good exemplars across the country. Like I think you've named a couple. I think Perscolas in New York City is a really famous example. Pursuit of these kind of sectoral partnerships bringing employers and workers together. But I do think absent kind of federal investment at a scale we don't have, it's going to be hard to kind of bring those further. In the absence of that happening, I mean, I don't think I want to understate the importance of the kind of really tight labor market we have right now, where workers have more power to find better jobs. And that isn't, in other words, I think it's important to think about workforce development in the context of a system of the labor market that includes training providers, it includes labor unions, it includes employers, of course. So, it may be the case that we can't get everything we want in this part, but there are other parts of the puzzle that we can try to improve at the same time.
Got back here and then up here.
Actually, it's just as well, because my question is related to the first one. You, in the discussion, you talked about the importance of good jobs and job stability for people in the labor market and the role that plays in communities. I'm curious as to your perspective on the reasons and the implications of the growth in part-time jobs as a percentage of total jobs created. I've seen different views on that. Some people think that workers are choosing this. There's other points of view. I'm curious as to what you think the reasons are, and then what the implications are for communities.
I mean, I think lots of thoughts. So I don't think part-time work is necessarily bad. You can imagine a lot of different reasons someone might want to work part-time, whether it's to provide care for a family member, to go to school at the same time, to explore a new career on the side of an existing job. I do think this is another place where, I think unfortunately at the federal level, we've really lagged at providing the protections that exist for kind of our standard full-time job. That probably isn't going to be solved anytime soon. But I think that, again, linking back to the kind of broader labor market, I think given the power that workers have right now, I hope that folks are able to kind of choose increasingly the job that works for them. I don't know, Prabal.
One of the things that I worry about is so few companies have done a good job building career ladders where people can go part-time and come back to full-time and then actually be candidates for top jobs. And I just think it's a huge problem, and it particularly affects parents. And in our society, that means it particularly affects women. And I think it's a real source of gender inequality that the part-time often means going on a totally different track long-term.
There is a data question the Fed looks at really closely around part-time, and why is it part-time? Is for economic reasons, for other reasons. I think that the question is, are you working part-time because your employer won't give you more hours and that's what you're given? Or are you working part-time because to switch jobs to a full-time job, right, it ends up costing you more because of the cost of childcare, transportation flexibility. So I guess I'd say, we need better data on the question of why is it that people are working part-time. Is it truly because this is something they want to do, or is it something that they have to do because the employer practices are not conducive to the childcare expense and the timing and how long it takes to get to work?
Both of you talked. Yes.
Yep.
Both of you talked about the role of the relatively high levels of unionization post-World War II relative to where we are now. You didn't actually use the numbers, but it's, in the private sector, it's under 6%. And, we have the highly visible union strike, auto union success, UAW success, and then a failure in Tennessee. But the unionization rates and
Yep.
the Farber, QJE article by Farber et al. On unions and inequality in the 20th century does a really great job of documenting what you both had said. In order for the labor market conditions on their own, can they be expected to accelerate unionization, particularly given the gig economy and the decentralization of jobs, or is something more explicit with respect to the role and powers of the National Labor Relations Board, the ability used to exploit right to work laws in the states which have them? There's one state that has actually reversed its right to work law. Do you see this as some place where new state initiatives are needed, or might the market, as it were, deliver the frictions in the market that unions create that may have positive consequences?
I don't think the labor market by itself can deliver, the heyday of the labor union movement from the 1930s. I think it can help, and I think the federal government, via the Inflation Reduction Act and elsewhere, is kind of providing nudges. A lot of the federal spending going out comes with requirements for project labor agreements. One of the executive orders mandates that we use a project labor agreement in any large federal construction project. But at the end of the day, these are all kind of nudges. I think this administration really fought to try to get something like the PRO Act passed, which would, I guess I don't, unionization in this country is really hard. And for those of you who don't know what the PRO Act is, it would be, a law that would make that a lot easier. I remember in summer 2021, I was on a trip with the vice president in Pittsburgh, and we met with the first unionized contractors of Google. They had unionized in 2019. We met them in 2021. They had not yet gotten an approved contract. So 2 years later, they still didn't have a contract. A month after we left, they did get their contract, thank God. But it's a 2-year process. They had to fight a really hard election. Under current rules, you would never run an election this way. Your employer can kind of hold you hostage in a room and just kind of, give you whatever propaganda they want. A person we met on that trip was trying to organize her kind of small tech startup, and I remember, she burst into tears at one point because of the retaliation and harassment she was facing from her boss for trying to organize their workplace. So I don't think it can be understated that unionization is hard and it requires a lot of bravery. And I think absent some more fundamental reforms, we're definitely not going to get back to kind of the heyday. But I do think that there is a really unique opportunity right now to make progress. I think some folks have talked about the fact that the United States has, you have to kind of win unions establishment by establishment. We don't have sectoral coverage largely, but, our neighbors to the North Canada, they also don't have sectoral coverage, and they have a unionization rate kind of 3 times ours. So, I think there's probably a ways to go to get there, but there are probably ways to move it up.
I think that's exactly the right point, which is the legislation is important, and I think the history is really important to think about here. This is the lack of prioritization on labor law reform is part of the Democratic Party becoming increasingly a party of more affluent college graduates since the 60s. It is the only major part of the Great Society that LBJ didn't get passed. LBJ, the famous guy who could arm twist Congress into doing whatever he wants, the only part of the Great Society he didn't get passed was labor law reform. It just wasn't a huge priority to him. Jimmy Carter had to choose between prioritizing the Panama Canal Treaty and labor law reform. He picked the Panama Canal Treaty, right? And I don't doubt that President Biden really wanted to pass it, but he didn't have the votes even with it in his own party. And on the one hand, that's interesting because labor law reform has been talked about so that these workers who are subjected to the kind of harassment you're talking about, if they want to join a union, they don't have to join a union, but if they want to, they actually can. You can look at that history and you say, wow, will labor law reform ever happen? You can also look at that history and say, wow, it's been almost 100 years since this country passed a law that made it meaningfully easier for workers to join unions. Maybe if we actually passed that law, more workers would join unions. And my guess is it's still one of these things that when Democrats who are running for president talk about what they want to do, it's always on their list and it's always pretty far down. And when Barack Obama ran for president, he said, I'm going to pass healthcare reform, and he did it. And Joe Biden ran for president, he said, I'm going to pass laws about clean energy, and he did it. And I think it's going to have to crack into that top 2 or 3 where a candidate says, I'm going to do this, not way down their campaign page as something they favor in order for it to actually happen. I think the mics are circulating. Also, Bill and I recommend seersucker on these hot days.
So I find it really promising, and I cheer the work that CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure investments have made in workforce and community colleges, programs and apprenticeships, et cetera. And folks like Burning Glass or Jobs for the Future have been good at identifying that there's a pretty significant new wine, old vessel challenge with the skills mismatch between what we're training workers for and what the jobs for the future will be. And that's before 2 years ago with generative AI. So my question is, given the increasing urgency of skills for the future in an era of generative AI, what are the pieces of your respective work that are even more important for making sure that as we make investments in kind of learning for life, that we're equipping people for contribution in the economy that will be here in 10 years and 20 years?
I'll start by taking a very close look at the population that we have and viewing people as assets, their skills. And I don't just mean that in a sort of like a generic, oh, we love people kind of way, but really, I'll give a couple examples. We have a lot of immigration coming into the U.S. I think it's recently at a somewhat higher rate than was expected. Do some of the immigrants coming in have training from their home countries? That's not, right? This is the classic example of the doctor driving a cab or something like that from before. But there's actually a lot of examples of people who are educators and they can't, work in a child care, right? And there's a shortage of child care. There's the lack of trying to take account of people's credentials if they have them. Thinking about English as a second language, workplace training, very, very underfunded. And you could do that with a state policy across a set of employers. And some of the little things like, well, when do you offer the class? Can you actually offer it during the workday? And maybe pay people during that class time, right? Because you're going to see the return. That employer's going to see the return, and everyone's going to see the return. Those types of employer practices, I think, or community practices, really stem from looking really closely at the population that you have. What are their needs? What sort of employer practices, do you need to change? I heard this story, and this is my take on. One company had a lot of Afghan refugees, and they had to stop work a couple of times just to have the prayer time for the Afghans. And I know in parts of the country you can say, well, you're implementing Sharia or something like that. It's like, no, this is just respect and sort of thinking about what is it that workers and people need. What are they bringing as skills? What might be small businesses that could start, and what training is needed for that? I'm a little off the workforce, but I really think that's a place, thinking about your organizations as really front doors. And I bet, I'm not a historian of this, but I bet if you looked back across the decades, you would find that this has actually occurred a lot in the U.S. in different ways that we've now have forgotten or don't really realize. And I think it's getting back to those types of things with an eye toward the common good for everyone, especially in this labor market.
We have time for one more, I think.
Okay. I have a question about measuring the results. So I think it's pretty clearly documented that unionization is going to be a very effective tool, and we apparently have the information that another effective tool is becoming the butt of a an attack article that helps a lot. But in the case of Lowell, but there's going to be skepticism about whether these programs are in place because we don't have the good documentation of the effectiveness of the programs or not. Where do we get that? How do we get that working in convincing ways?
Take this question of value.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you raised a really good question, and I think one of my reflections over the past couple of years is there's kind of always a balance between wanting to research more and wanting to take action. I think it's really important that, and most federal programs kind of have this built in, funding for evaluation. It's usually never enough. It's usually not enough for a randomized controlled trial or something that could prove causality. But at the same time, I do think sometimes evidence can only take you so far. I think one of the things that this White House fought really hard for and did not get over the finish line is universal preschool. At this point, we don't need any more research to show that preschool is a good investment for children. We can keep researching it and come up with how do we improve preschool programs, et cetera. But we kind of know that baseline fact. And I think there are domains like that where you kind of have enough to kind of take the leap, and people who aren't going to believe you are always going to find reasons to nitpick and say, oh, you didn't control for this or didn't control for that, or actually it didn't work over here, which is all legitimate and all should be sorted out by academics. But I think you're always going to get that criticism no matter the research base you ever have. And I think that was I guess as a Marshall, of course, I love research. I love data. And I think that was one of my big learnings getting into the government, is at a certain point you have enough and you can't keep researching. You kind of got to just do. So
I just have a side note, which is how special this is for me. I was on the selection committee that selected Michael. So this is just so wonderful for me, and I'm just first.
Anything I said wrong, it's
no. So I have to think once again. I'm really glad that I interviewed for the Marshall in 1994 and not when Michael was interviewing in 2010 or whichever 2012, whichever year it was. I'm saying that this question of evaluation is a huge one, and I mentioned social finance before. This sort of pay for success impact bond, that's sort of a gold standard that they're going for, close to it. One thing I've observed that doesn't happen enough is data that is sort of longitudinal, that follows the people. A lot of the data, there's always a lag, and it's always a community. So I go to Lawrence or Lowell or Brattleboro, Hartford, and we look at this data and we follow median family income. We want to see that go up over time, and people who get more money will move out, and they were living in affordable or subsidized housing, and they find a home, but it's outside. New people come in because that's it's crowded housing conditions, but this is where they can find a place to live, and so the numbers aren't going to move. So you got to follow the people. It's really hard to do that with our systems. I wish there's some states that do a really good job. For example, in workforce, the Louisiana community college system does a terrific job following people all the way through. They can tell you exactly which major or which can do. I think you were maybe on the prize for the Aspen Prize for this exactly. But in my state of Massachusetts, it's very difficult to follow the people. We really don't know. And you'd think we would be the ones that, Massachusetts is full of itself, right? Because we're doing a great job, but we're actually not. We can do a lot better with data, and that's why Chetty's work was so powerful, right? And be able to follow people. And we need to be able to do that more often.
We're standing between you all and lunch. So please join me in thanking Michael and Prabal.